August 20th, 1944, northern France. The war moved faster than anyone had dared imagine. The fields that once echoed with retreat now thundered with the advance of the Allied armies. Endless convoys rolled over cracked roads, raising clouds of dust that clung to uniforms and dreams alike. The air was thick with the rumble of engines and the sharp scent of gasoline. The Red Ball Express, a lifeline born from desperation, snaked across the countryside like veins of steel. In one of those trucks, Private Samuel Harris leaned against the wheel, his eyes heavy but fixed ahead. He hadn't slept in 3 days, nor had most of the men driving beside him. The command was simple, but absolute. Keep Patton's Third Army moving east. For every tank that advanced, a dozen trucks followed behind, carrying the pulse of war. The soldiers knew it. If they stopped, so would victory. The roads were alive with noise, horns blaring, tires grinding, men shouting over the wind. Each truck carried its own heartbeat, cans of fuel, crates of ammunition, sacks of food. In the twilight, their headlights stretched like a golden river cutting through the dark. To the drivers, every mile was a battle against fatigue, against time, against the crumbling roads of a liberated France. Bridges were repaired on the go, maps redrawn by hand, and orders relayed through dust and static. The French countryside, once scarred by occupation, now bore the scars of liberation. Churned soil, burned villages, abandoned helmets half buried in mud. Yet through it all, the convoy pressed on, driven by duty more than by hope. Far behind the front, in a dimly lit headquarters near Chartres, German General Günther Blumentritt studied the situation with cold amusement. Around him, officers leaned over a tattered map, tracing the Allied advance with tired fingers. "They can't keep this up," he murmured, his tone confident but weary. "The Americans are stretching themselves thin. Their tanks run on gasoline, not courage." The others laughed, nodding in agreement, their pride undimmed despite the defeats. They saw the Allies not as victors, but as overconfident amateurs, giants with feet of clay. The Germans believed that supply would be their undoing, that soon the mighty American war machine would choke on its own speed. Outside that room, however, the reality was very different. The Americans were learning to fight a war that no manual had ever taught. Mechanics worked by lantern light, patching trucks with spare parts scavenged from wrecks. Drivers navigated by instinct, guided only by the glow of the convoy ahead. The Red Ball Express became a symbol of endurance, a ceaseless artery pumping life into the front. Each delivery, each gallon of fuel carried the weight of nations. Men joked about the long drives, but they knew the cost of failure. Without them, Patton's tanks would stand silent, their barrels cold, their momentum gone. As night fell across the countryside, the convoys didn't stop. Their engines roared through the darkness, defying exhaustion and the dangers that lurked beyond the headlights. The drivers carried pistols on their hips, knowing German stragglers still roamed the forests. Every bend in the road could hide an ambush. Every bridge could collapse under the strain. But there was no choice. The war didn't wait for rest. The soldiers drove through storms, through hunger, through the haunting silence between towns that no longer existed. They were not heroes in the newspapers, but the war owed them its heartbeat. Beyond the hills, the German army was retreating, but not defeated. Columns of soldiers moved eastward, battered yet disciplined, clinging to what remained of their strength. Their commanders still believed that time was on their side, that the American supply lines would snap before the Reich collapsed. "Let them advance," one officer muttered, staring into the distance. "They'll run out of fuel before they reach the Rhine." But the irony of war is cruel. Those same roads that carried German confidence would soon witness their despair. The Americans weren't just advancing. They were rewriting the very rhythm of modern warfare. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and smoke. The trucks rolled on, silhouettes against the dying light. To the men inside, the day never truly ended. It only bled into another night of motion. The hum of engines was their lullaby, the road their constant companion. They carried no medals, no banners, only the responsibility of 1 million fighting men ahead of them. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Patton's armored columns pushed forward, unaware that their fuel came from the grit and sweat of unseen soldiers. The war's front line wasn't only drawn on maps, it ran through every driver's hands on the steering wheel. In those days, courage didn't always roar from the barrel of a gun. Sometimes it rumbled quietly on the back of a truck, through mud and exhaustion. The Red Ball drivers were young, untested, and terrified. Yet they kept the war alive mile after mile. Behind them, depots buzzed with frantic activity, men loading crates, shouting orders, refueling engines that barely had time to cool. Each convoy was a miracle of motion, each success a victory over chaos. They were ordinary men, carrying the extraordinary burden of history. Across the lines, German commanders misread the silence between battles as weakness. They didn't see the storm gathering in the distance, the quiet efficiency of an army learning to outlast them. They had mocked the Americans for their dependency, for their machines, for their endless supply columns. Yet soon, it would be the Germans watching their own tanks sit empty, their guns abandoned, their soldiers starving in the ruins. The arrogance of confidence would meet the hunger of defeat. The roads of France became the veins of war, pulsing with dust, fear, and determination. Every engine that started was a promise, every delivery a victory unseen. As the wind carried the echo of engines across the fields, a truth began to take shape. Wars are not only won by those who fight at the front, but by those who keep the front alive. The Germans hadn't yet learned that truth, but they would, and by the time they did, it would already be too late. In the summer of 1944, Europe trembled under the shifting tides of war. The Allies had broken free from the beaches of Normandy, shattering the walls of Fortress Europe that had held firm for 4 long years. From Caen to Saint-Lô, from the hedgerows to the open plains, the sound of engines replaced the silence of occupation. Operation Cobra, launched in late July, had torn a hole in the German defenses, unleashing the power of Patton's newly activated Third Army. What followed was not just a breakout, it was a flood. American tanks poured through the breach, rolling across France with a ferocity that even their commanders hadn't anticipated. Yet behind the thunder of armor came a quieter, more fragile force, the trucks that carried the lifeblood of war. For every Sherman tank that roared across the countryside, it took hundreds of gallons of fuel, each one delivered by hand, by wheel, by will. The American advance, though glorious, was devouring its own success. Fuel depots near the beaches struggled to keep up. Pipelines lagged far behind the front, and rail lines lay twisted by retreating German engineers. The men who had stormed Normandy were now racing toward the Seine. But every mile they gained stretched their supply lines thinner until they resembled a thread pulled taut across the map. The German High Command watched this with bitter amusement, believing that the Americans were sprinting towards disaster. Inside Hitler's Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the atmosphere was thick with denial and fury. Reports of the Allied breakthrough poured in daily, each one worse than the last. Hitler's generals urged him to withdraw, to regroup behind the Seine, but he refused. "The Americans are slaves to logistics," he barked. "They'll drown in their own fuel cans before they reach the border." His faith in the exhaustion of the enemy became a strategy of hope, a dangerous illusion. German divisions were bleeding to death, their own supply lines shattered by Allied bombers that ruled the skies. Yet Hitler still clung to the belief that the enemy's speed would destroy them faster than his own stagnation. Meanwhile, in England and northern France, Allied planners faced a logistical nightmare of their own making. Success had come too quickly. What had been planned as a gradual, methodical advance had turned into a pursuit, and the intricate supply system designed for a cautious campaign now had to feed an army moving faster than any in modern history. The ports of Normandy could not handle the tonnage needed. The British were advancing toward Belgium, the Americans toward the German border, and the supply depots were still clustered near the coast. The distance between the beaches and the front was growing daily, and with it, the risk of starvation. Not of food, but of fuel. To solve the crisis, General John C. H. Lee, head of the communication zone, proposed an audacious plan. A continuous loop of trucks running from the ports to the front, day and night, without pause. The operation was codenamed the Red Ball Express, inspired by the old American railroad term for high-priority cargo. Its symbol, a red circle painted on every vehicle, became a mark of urgency and pride. Between August and November 1944, more than 6,000 trucks would thunder across northern France, manned largely by African-American drivers serving in segregated units. Their task was thankless, dangerous, and endless. They would carry fuel, ammunition, and supplies through terrain still scarred by battle, where mines, ambushes, and exhaustion were as deadly as any bullet. While Allied engineers raced to repair bridges and clear roads, German forces retreated in chaos. Entire divisions melted away, their vehicles abandoned for lack of gasoline. The Luftwaffe was nearly grounded, its fuel reserves reduced to a fraction of what they once were. German commanders like Field Marshal Model and General von Kluge fought to restore order, but they were commanding ghosts, divisions that existed only on paper. And yet, despite their own shortages, many in the Wehrmacht still believed that the Americans' logistical overreach would bring salvation. They underestimated the industrial might that lay behind every truck, every can of fuel, every meal shipped across the Atlantic. In the cities of the United States, factories worked around the clock. Trains clattered through the night carrying ammunition, rations, and gasoline to ports like Southampton and Cherbourg. Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic in convoys, their holds packed with the promise of victory. For the Americans, war had become a matter of movement, of keeping men, machines, and fuel in perfect rhythm. The Red Ball Express was the heartbeat of that rhythm, a rolling testament to the industrial miracle that defined the Allied effort. And though it was born out of necessity, it would soon become a symbol of endurance unmatched in the annals of modern warfare. Back in France, Patton's Third Army surged forward with unrelenting aggression. Town after town fell in rapid succession: Le Mans, Chartres, Orléans. The German Seventh Army, cut off and broken, retreated toward the Seine, leaving behind a trail of destruction. Patton's tanks raced to encircle the enemy at Falaise, trapping tens of thousands in a pocket that became a slaughterhouse. Yet even as victory loomed, the cracks in the Allied advance began to show. Fuel trucks couldn't reach the front fast enough. Tanks stalled in open fields, their crews helpless as the enemy slipped away. Patton fumed, cursing the shortages that turned triumph into frustration. By early September, the Allies had crossed the Seine and liberated Paris, but their momentum was faltering. The Red Ball Express ran at full capacity, but it was never enough. The farther east the armies pushed, the longer the supply lines became. Bridges collapsed under constant traffic. Tires burst from overuse. Engines burned out. Drivers slept in their seats, living off coffee, cigarettes, and adrenaline. The Americans had proven their power on the battlefield, but sustaining it was becoming an impossible challenge. German intelligence officers, watching the advance from the safety of bunkers, saw their enemy's exhaustion and mistook it for collapse. Yet the Americans didn't collapse. They adapted. Depots were moved closer to the front, new routes carved through the countryside, and fuel priorities reshuffled to keep the armor moving. The Red Ball Express evolved into a lifeline so efficient that even German prisoners marveled at its speed. What the Wehrmacht called overextension, the Americans turned into innovation. But the strain was visible. Each day, more men fell asleep at the wheel. More trucks broke down before reaching their destinations. The miracle of motion had a price, and both sides were about to pay it. And so, as summer bled into autumn, the great race across France reached its invisible limit. Patton's spearheads neared the Moselle River. The British stalled before Antwerp, and the once laughing German generals began to feel the shadow of defeat creeping closer. But even then, they clung to a final hope that winter would come before the fuel, that the Allied engine of war would sputter to a halt. In the war rooms of the Reich, they still mocked the American convoys, believing that no army could outrun its own supply. They would soon discover how wrong they were. By early September 1944, the war in Western Europe had reached a fevered tempo. The German army, battered and retreating, was in disarray, yet not destroyed. The Allies, sensing the end, pressed forward with an almost reckless confidence. Patton's Third Army thundered across the French countryside, its tanks devouring the miles, its soldiers dreaming of reaching the German border before the autumn rains. The once invincible Wehrmacht had become a shadow of itself, but the shadow still fought, buying time with blood. The Red Ball Express roared behind the front lines, its engines echoing across valleys and villages. Each convoy was a race against silence, the silence of empty fuel tanks, of stalled momentum, of opportunity slipping away. The men driving those trucks didn't see glory. They saw exhaustion, broken roads, and the endless horizon ahead. In the Allied command tents, the euphoria of victory was already giving way to tension. General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a choice that would define the campaign: where to strike next. The British under Montgomery demanded priority for a northern thrust toward the Ruhr, aiming to end the war by Christmas. Patton, ever audacious, argued that his army should lead the advance deep into Germany before the enemy could regroup. "Give me the fuel," he told his superiors, "and I'll put the Germans out of business." But fuel was precisely what he lacked. Every gallon had to be measured, every truck accounted for, and the Red Ball Express was running at its limit. Eisenhower's broad front strategy required that every army be supplied, but the reality of logistics made that balance impossible. Someone would have to slow down. Meanwhile, inside the roaring trucks of the Red Ball Express, men like Private Harris lived minute to minute. Sleep became a luxury. Meals were whatever could be eaten one-handed on the road. Drivers learned to steer by instinct, memorizing every curve and bump of the route from Normandy to the front. They painted slogans on their trucks: Hitler's gravedigger, Patton's fuel or bust. The convoys moved in blackout conditions, headlights covered, their only light the dim red tail lamps of the truck ahead. German stragglers and snipers haunted the routes, but the drivers pressed on. Each trip was a gamble with fate, but without their deliveries, entire divisions would grind to a halt. They were the invisible soldiers of the war, unarmed in spirit, but iron-willed in purpose. Back at German headquarters, the mood had shifted from arrogance to grim calculation. Reports from the front painted a desperate picture. Tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, divisions scattered, bridges destroyed. Yet some commanders clung to hope. General Walter Model, now commanding Army Group B, believed the Allies had overextended. "They move fast," he told his staff, "but they cannot move forever." German reconnaissance planes photographed the endless Allied columns stretching across France, and the intelligence officers smiled. To them, the Americans were trapped by their own success. If the Wehrmacht could strike the supply lines, even once, the entire Allied advance could stall. The idea of counterattack began to take shape, a final gamble to turn speed into weakness. For the men at the front, the race against time was brutal. Patton's armored columns were consuming gasoline faster than it could be delivered. In some units, fuel was siphoned from wrecked vehicles or borrowed from neighboring divisions. Mechanics modified engines to run on low-octane reserves. Crews rolled tanks downhill to save fuel, joking bitterly that the next hill might be their last. Patton's temper grew sharper with each report of shortages. "My men can eat their belts," he barked, "but my tanks need gas." His army's momentum slowed, not because of German resistance, but because the lifeblood of war was running dry. Across France, Allied supply officers worked around the clock, turning chaos into order. Every available truck, every gallon, every spare tire was pushed toward the front. Makeshift depots sprang up in fields and barns, guarded by tired men with grease-stained hands. Pilots flew emergency fuel drops, landing on the improvised airstrips. Engineers repaired bridges faster than the convoys could cross them. It was a war fought not just by soldiers, but by logistics. A machine of men, steel, and willpower. Yet even as they adapted, the challenge grew. Roads turned to mud after rain. Convoys clogged traffic, and maintenance crews collapsed from exhaustion. The miracle of motion was beginning to falter under its own weight. In the towns they passed, the French watched in awe. Children waved as the convoys thundered by, their faces lit by the glow of engines. Villagers offered bread, wine, and cheers to the young men who never stopped long enough to respond. To the civilians, these Americans seemed invincible. Their machines unending, their energy boundless. But inside those trucks, the truth was different. Drivers fought to stay awake, tying ropes from their wrists to the steering wheel to keep from drifting into sleep. Some never made it to the front, their trucks found overturned on the roadside, cargo burning in the night. The war's unsung heroes were burning out, 1 mile at a time. By mid-September, the weather began to change. The summer sun gave way to cold winds sweeping across the open plains. The roads became slick, the nights longer and the fog thicker. The Red Ball Express struggled through mud and fatigue, while German saboteurs began targeting bridges and depots. The once straight lines of supply twisted into a labyrinth of detours and danger. Still, the Americans refused to stop. The fuel flowed, slower, thinner, but steady. Every canister that reached Patton's front meant another step forward. But the limit was approaching, invisible yet inevitable. The trucks could only carry so much. The men could only endure so long. In the German High Command, desperation gave birth to calculation. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and General Jodl urged Hitler to prepare for a counterstroke. They reasoned that if the Allies were running on fumes, one swift blow could paralyze them. The Ardennes, once again, appeared on German maps as the perfect ground, familiar, forested, and underestimated. The seeds of what would become the Battle of the Bulge were quietly being sown, born from the belief that the enemy's supply lines were their Achilles' heel. The Germans planned, but the Americans were already at their own breaking point, their engines gasping, their soldiers weary. By late September, the front began to stall. Patton's men reached the Moselle, but without fuel, their tanks sat idle on the riverbanks. The British faced similar struggles near Antwerp, while Montgomery's grand gamble at Arnhem collapsed in tragedy. The Allied advance, which had once seemed unstoppable, slowed to a crawl. The German generals had been right about one thing. Even giants could tire. But what they didn't realize was that the Americans were learning. They were reshaping war itself, discovering that victory didn't just belong to those who fought hardest, but to those who could move longest. The storm that would decide Europe was not over. It was gathering. And as the autumn winds swept across the battlefields of France, the laughter that once echoed in German headquarters grew quieter. The Americans might have been running low on fuel, but the Germans were running out of time. The roads that once promised salvation now led only eastward, toward the borders of a crumbling Reich. The war was shifting again, and soon it would remind the world that every engine, no matter how strong, eventually runs dry. The autumn of 1944 brought with it a bitter chill that seeped into the bones of every soldier and driver across northern France. The fields, once golden and soft beneath the summer sun, had turned to mud, swallowing the wheels of trucks and tanks alike. The Red Ball Express still roared on, but the strain was showing. Engines coughed, tires burst, and the endless roads became rivers of exhaustion. Private Harris drove through nights so dark he could barely see the truck ahead of him. Rain streaked across his windshield, blurring the headlights into ghostly trails of light. Each mile felt longer than the last, and every gallon of fuel became more precious than gold. At the front, Patton's tanks idled helplessly, waiting for deliveries that never came in time. He stood in the rain, coat flapping, watching his army. Once unstoppable, slowed by the very lifeline that had given it strength. "They'll laugh at us for running dry," he muttered, his voice drowned by the wind. Yet even then, He knew the laughter wouldn't last forever. In the German camps, that laughter had already begun. Generals, wrapped in their greatcoats, gathered around flickering lamps and maps covered with grease marks and fading ink. They traced the Allied lines and saw what they wanted to see: an army stretched beyond endurance. "The Americans," said one officer, "fight with machines, not with spirit. When their gasoline ends, so will their courage." They believed their old gods of war, discipline, willpower, and sacrifice, would outlast this new enemy of industry. But reality was cruel. The Wehrmacht's own fuel trains lay in ruins, bombed by Allied aircraft that now owned the skies. German columns marched on foot through forests once crossed by panzer divisions. Tanks were towed by horses, artillery abandoned in ditches. Their belief in the enemy's collapse was all they had left to cling to. They didn't yet realize that the Americans, for all their strain, could replace what Germany could not: time, fuel, and men. By October, the roads of France had turned into the arteries of destiny. The Red Ball Express became more than a convoy. It was a symbol of defiance, of motion that refused to die. Drivers like Harris pushed through storms, hunger, and the numbing ache of repetition. Some trucks never returned, swallowed by darkness or caught in enemy fire. Others limped back with empty tanks and burned-out engines, their drivers asleep before they even stopped. Yet, for every loss, another truck rolled out, another man took the wheel. Behind them, factories across the Atlantic roared louder, ships crossed the ocean in endless streams, and fuel depots filled again. The Germans, once confident that the Allies would starve on the road to victory, now found themselves stranded in silence. The mockery that once echoed in their command tents faded beneath the sound of engines. American engines, still running, still advancing, carrying war to the heart of Germany. The rain fell in sheets across the French countryside, turning roads into rivers of mud and metal. It was October 1944, and the Allied advance, once as swift as a storm, had slowed to a crawl. Convoys strained to keep up with the hunger of war, their tires churning through sludge, their headlights muted under the gray sky. Patton's Third Army, now poised along the Moselle River, had momentum but no means. His Sherman tanks sat lined along the fields, their turrets aimed toward the east, their engines silent for lack of fuel. Soldiers huddled under canvas, lighting cigarettes against the wind, waiting for the sound of engines that meant supplies were coming. But sometimes, the only sound was the distant thunder of German artillery, a reminder that the enemy had not yet yielded. The Red Ball Express was fighting a different kind of battle now, not against bullets, but against distance, weather, and exhaustion. Private Harris's convoy rolled out before dawn, engines roaring against the mist. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other clutching a thermos of black coffee gone cold. His co-driver slept beside him, chin resting on his chest, as rain tapped a steady rhythm on the roof. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 trucks, and lined with the carcasses of wrecked vehicles, reminders of those who hadn't made it. Each turn demanded faith, each mile demanded nerve. The radio crackled occasionally, a lifeline in the static. "Convoy Bravo 2, maintain speed. Destination, Nancy, urgent delivery. Third Army needs it yesterday." Harris pressed harder on the pedal. Ahead, a sign flashed by: "Red Ball route, keep 'em rolling." It wasn't just a slogan. It was an order written in dust and diesel. As the convoys advanced, the Germans regrouped. Near Metz, the defenders dug in behind rivers and hills, determined to make the Americans pay for every inch. Patton's armor lunged forward, smashing through resistance with brutal precision, but each maneuver burned through precious gallons of fuel. His commanders radioed back in frustration. Tanks couldn't chase ghosts without gas. Patton stormed into his field headquarters, slamming his gloves onto the table. "We've whipped them," he snapped. "But we can't finish the job because I can't drive a tank on hopes and prayers." His staff worked feverishly, calculating fuel loads and ration schedules. Every drop mattered. To feed Patton's aggression, other units had to starve. It was a cruel arithmetic, one that even victory couldn't soften. In the skies above, Allied bombers continued to strangle the German heartland. They targeted oil refineries, fuel depots, and rail lines, crippling the enemy's last reserves. In cities like Merseburg and Ludwigshafen, columns of black smoke spiraled into the clouds, marking the slow death of Germany's mobility. Tanks that once terrorized Europe now stood as lifeless hulks, empty and forgotten. Still, the German generals refused to surrender their pride. They had once mocked the Americans for their dependence on gasoline, calling them slaves to machines. But now it was the Wehrmacht that knelt before the altar of scarcity. General Model cursed the bombers that circled overhead. "They fight with factories," he muttered, "and we fight with fumes." His staff said nothing. They all knew it was true. On the ground, the Red Ball Express carried on through the wreckage of Europe. The routes were chaos, clogged with civilian carts, horses, tanks, and endless mud. Military police directed traffic with rifles slung across their shoulders, waving convoys through like conductors of an orchestra made of chaos. Drivers cursed, sang, and prayed in equal measure. When fuel ran low, they siphoned from abandoned vehicles or drained spare cans by hand. Repairs were done on the roadside, engines fixed with wire and hope. There were no brakes, no rotations, just movement. The sound of engines became the heartbeat of liberation, constant and defiant. Every drop of fuel delivered was another blow struck against the Reich. The battles along the Moselle turned savage. German artillery rained down on bridges and crossroads, targeting the arteries of supply. Convoys were ambushed in narrow valleys, their trucks set ablaze in the night. Harris saw one ahead of him, a column struck by a mortar shell, its cargo burning bright enough to light the rain. He slowed his truck, hands trembling on the wheel, but the radio crackled. "Keep moving! Don't stop for anything!" He pressed on, eyes fixed forward, the flames reflecting off his windshield like ghosts of the fallen. Behind him, the sky glowed red, and the road trembled under the weight of passing trucks. The war didn't pause for grief. It rolled on, merciless, unstoppable. In November, Patton's men fought their way toward the city of Metz, a fortress once thought impregnable. The Germans defended it with fanatical resolve, and the weather turned against the Allies. Cold rain became sleet, sleet became snow, and the roads froze into treacherous ribbons of ice. Trucks skidded off embankments, their cargo spilling into ditches. Yet somehow the Red Ball Express endured. Mechanics wrapped engines in blankets to keep them warm. Drivers burned ration boxes for heat, and convoys continued through storms that swallowed the world in white. "We'll get it through," one sergeant said, gripping the wheel as snow lashed the windshield. "We always do." And somehow they did. By the end of the month, Metz had fallen. Patton's Third Army had bled for it, not just in battle, but in endurance. Thousands of gallons of fuel, tons of ammunition, and countless lives had been spent to capture a single city. The Germans withdrew eastward once more, leaving behind only rubble and frozen dead. For a moment, it seemed the momentum might return, that the road to the Rhine was open again. But deep within Germany, Hitler was planning something reckless. A final strike that would exploit the very weakness his generals had once mocked. The Americans were stretched thin, their supply lines vulnerable, their confidence unshaken. He would attack where they least expected it. The Ardennes. As December crept in, the roads grew quiet. The Red Ball convoys still ran, but slower now, fewer in number. Snow blanketed the land, softening the scars of war. Soldiers spoke of home, of Christmas, of an end that finally felt within reach. Yet beneath the peace lay a tension, an unease that even rest could not ease. In the forests of Belgium, German armor gathered in secret, engines idling under camouflage nets. They would strike soon, aiming not at the armies themselves, but at their lifelines. The trucks, the bridges, the fuel. The Germans had once mocked the American reliance on logistics. Now they would test it in fire. When the attack came, it came like thunder. In the early hours of December 16th, 1944, the forests erupted. Artillery shattered the stillness, and waves of German tanks surged through the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. For days, chaos reigned. Convoys were trapped, fuel depots captured, entire routes cut off. Drivers abandoned their trucks under fire, retreating through snow and smoke. But even as the German offensive tore into the Allied lines, the Red Ball Express reformed. Drivers rerouted through alternate paths, hauling fuel to the front despite the danger. The same men who had carried victory through summer now carried survival through winter. Their courage, unheralded and unseen, became the hinge upon which the fate of the Western Front turned. By New Year's Day, 1945, the German attack had lost its momentum. They had captured ground, but not victory. Their tanks, once roaring with menace, now sat still. Their fuel gone, their dreams extinguished. The Americans, battered but unbroken, surged back. The convoys rolled again, reclaiming the roads of Belgium and France. What the Germans had mocked had defeated them. The fuel they had hoped would run dry had kept burning, carried by men who refused to stop. The roads of war were littered with wreckage, but through it all, the Red Ball Express kept moving, a symbol of endurance, of industry, and of an army that refused to die standing still. When the guns finally fell silent across the Ardennes, the land lay scarred and broken. Burned-out trucks and shattered tanks dotted the frozen fields like steel gravestones. The Battle of the Bulge had cost the Allies dearly. 80,000 casualties, towns destroyed, supplies lost. But it had cost Germany far more. Their final gamble had drained what little fuel remained, and their armies, once feared across Europe, now crawled on fumes. In the aftermath, the Red Ball Express resumed its relentless rhythm, restoring the lifelines that had nearly been severed. Convoys rumbled eastward once more, carrying the pulse of an advancing army. The roads that had nearly bled dry now flowed again with fuel, ammunition, and hope. What began as a desperate improvisation had become the very backbone of victory. The men who drove those trucks rarely appeared in headlines. They didn't wear medals or sit in command tents. They were mechanics, dock workers, and farmhands who learned to drive through chaos. Day and night, they pushed through rain and gunfire, through fear and fatigue, often sleeping in their seats between convoys. Some never returned. Their trucks vanished into ditches, their bodies lost to the cold. Yet without them, no tank would have rolled, no army would have advanced. We moved history, one veteran would later say, mile by mile, gallon by gallon. It was not glory they sought, but completion. The knowledge that somewhere ahead, a soldier could fight because they had done their part. In the spring of 1945, as the snow melted and the roads cleared, the Allied advance resumed in full force. The Third Army crossed the Rhine, breaching the final barrier into Germany. Supply convoys followed in endless columns, crossing makeshift pontoon bridges under the watchful eyes of engineers and gunners. Every truck carried not just fuel, but the momentum of months of struggle. German towns fell one after another, their resistance brief and desperate. Factories stood silent, their machinery gutted, their workers gone. The mighty Wehrmacht that once boasted of mechanized perfection, now moved by horse cart and desperation. The mockery that once echoed in their command posts had turned to bitter silence. They had underestimated the one thing America possessed in endless supply: willpower. For the men of the Red Ball Express, the war's final months were a blur of motion. Even as the front moved east, they pushed through bombed-out cities, over bridges rebuilt overnight, through smoke that smelled of both victory and exhaustion. They delivered fuel to Patton's tanks as they surrounded trapped German armies in the Ruhr pocket. They carried rations to Eisenhower's headquarters as plans for Germany's surrender took shape. Some convoys even rolled into Czechoslovakia and Austria, bringing supplies to the very edge of Hitler's crumbling empire. The road that had begun on the beaches of Normandy now stretched across a liberated continent, a testament to endurance and determination. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, Europe exhaled for the first time in 6 years. In towns across France and Belgium, the rumble of engines gave way to the sound of celebration. Church bells, laughter, music. The drivers of the Red Ball Express parked their trucks for the last time, some wiping away tears they hadn't realized were falling. They had lived on wheels, fought on wheels, and won on wheels. But now, the roads that had been arteries of war became paths of peace. Many of the men who drove them returned home, quietly, their uniforms faded, their names forgotten by history. Yet every mile they traveled had carried the weight of freedom itself. In the ruins of Germany, the lessons of logistics became gospel for modern warfare. Commanders studied the Red Ball Express as a model of efficiency under pressure, a feat of organization unmatched in scale. It had moved nearly 500,000 tons of supplies in just 3 months, a river of motion that turned industrial might into battlefield momentum. General Eisenhower himself would later remark that the campaign could not have succeeded without it. In a war defined by tanks and planes, it was the humble truck and the men who drove it that proved decisive. The Germans, for all their brilliance in tactics, had failed to grasp that wars are not only won by strategy, but by sustenance. Among the German generals, the realization came too late. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had once sneered at the Americans' fuel addiction, now stood defeated before a map of his broken nation. The Reich's famed panzers had become immobile monuments, abandoned where they ran dry. His staff officers spoke in whispers of how their armies had been strangled, not by bullets, but by logistics. "We mocked their abundance," one colonel admitted, "but it was abundance that destroyed us." The irony was as bitter as the cold that settled over the ruins of their homeland. What they had once ridiculed had been their undoing. In the years that followed, the Red Ball Express faded into memory, overshadowed by grander tales of battles and heroes. But among those who knew, its legend endured. It became a symbol of determination, of men who drove through hell so others could fight another day. Museums would later display the olive-drab trucks, their paint chipped and their tires worn smooth as relics of endurance. Historians would write that the road to victory was paved not only with courage, but with rubber, oil, and sweat. It was the proof that wars are not won solely by those who fight, but by those who keep the fighters alive. By 1946, Europe began to heal. The convoys gave way to reconstruction, and the roads once marked by shell craters now carried supplies for rebuilding, not destruction. The same hands that once delivered ammunition now hauled lumber and grain. The legacy of the Red Ball Express lived on. In every road rebuilt, every bridge restored, every life returned to motion. What had been born out of desperation became the foundation of a new beginning. The spirit of those drivers, relentless, unyielding, unseen, lingered long after the guns went silent. When the last truck engine went silent and the dust of Europe settled, the war that had consumed the world finally released its grip. The men who had once thundered down endless roads under the banner of the Red Ball Express stood at the edge of a quiet dawn. The fields that had been torn by shellfire now shimmered with dew, the same roads that carried war now echoing with the soft steps of peace. For many, it felt unreal to look upon the same horizon and not expect smoke. The sky, once dark with bombers, stretched blue and empty above them. Yet in that silence beneath the relief, there lingered a memory that would never fade. The sound of engines, the hum of purpose, the steady rhythm that had kept an army alive. Those who had driven through that inferno would never forget the feeling of steel beneath their hands, the weight of responsibility in every mile. They had seen the best and worst of humanity. Comrades laughing in the face of fear, towns reborn from ashes, and the quiet courage that comes not from glory but from duty. Each convoy had been a promise that no soldier would be left without fuel, no advance would stall, no flame of hope would die for lack of motion. They were not celebrated generals or decorated heroes. They were men in grease-stained uniforms, nameless in history books, but eternal in the victory they helped forge. "You can't win a war without bullets," one said years later, "but you can't fire bullets without gas." Simple words, profound truth. The German officers who once mocked American abundance learned that lesson too late. Their panzers, magnificent and deadly, had withered where their fuel tanks emptied. Their plans, precise and confident, had collapsed beneath the weight of starvation. In the end, their war machine was undone not by superior firepower, but by the quiet persistence of supply. The invisible war waged on roads and rails, fought by men who never saw the front line. It was logistics that broke the back of the Reich. The same convoys they ridiculed had crushed them, 1 gallon at a time. History is merciless in its irony. The mocking laughter of German generals faded long before the rumble of Allied trucks ceased to echo across France. As Europe rebuilt, the Red Ball Express became a story told in fragments, in memoirs, in faded photographs, in the memories of men who had driven from dusk till dawn. Some of them returned home to nothing, others to quiet towns that would never understand the scale of what they had done. But for those who knew, for those who had seen the roads of war stretch endlessly before them, the truth was simple. They had carried victory. Theirs was the road that led freedom forward. They had proven that courage could drive a truck, that endurance could steer through hell, and that history moves not only by those who fight, but by those who keep the fighters alive. Today, the story of the Red Ball Express stands as a monument to unseen valor, to the men who rolled through mud and fire so that others could advance. Their roads, their sweat, and their silence built the bridge between chaos and triumph. In every mile of their journey lay the heartbeat of victory, steady and unbroken. And though decades have passed, their legacy endures in every soldier's march, every supply line drawn, every whisper of an engine that keeps the promise of persistence alive. For in the great machinery of war, it is often the quiet gears that turn the tide. In the smoke and silence that followed, one truth remained. Courage is never outdated. This is WW2 Revisited, where history lives again.